The mission of the OECD is to promote policies that will improve the economic and social well-being of people around the world. For the OECD, as for many other organizations, a great focus right now is, of course, the question of skills and labor market integration of refugees. And it is a very great honor that we have Mr. Scarpetta here now as our keynote speaker. Mr. Stefano Scarpetta is the Director of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD, and he is also our keynote speaker. So very warmly welcome to Malmö.
Thank you very, very much. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here, ladies and gentlemen. It was not easy, but I finally managed, and I am particularly pleased to be able to address all of you with a topic that is, in my view, essential, very, very important. As you probably know, we are doing a lot of work to assist the countries in the very difficult challenge of providing immediate support, but also of promoting the process of integration of refugees in the host countries. And you probably will not be surprised, what we have been saying over and over is that the role of the Public Employment Service is very much central in this task. I'm very much aware of the challenges that you're all facing, but I think, again, your role is vital, is very important. Integration into the labor market is one very important step into the full integration of the refugees, those who are going to stay in the country, into our economies and in our societies. What I would like to do is to walk you through some of the evidence, many of which you know from your own individual countries, but more from an international perspective. And again, drawing from the work we have done at the OECD, try to highlight what are, in our view, some of the key challenges. Some of you probably know that we have been working on policies to promote the integration of migrants, more generally, for quite some time. Last year, we published a joint publication with the European Commission on the integration of migrants, and we look at the broad range of policies, from integration of children and students into the education system, to integration into the labor market, to integration into our societies. And what we have done also, together with the UNHCR, last year at the beginning of this year, is to try to see how these lessons, general lessons about integration, including, of course, the integration of legal migrants, could apply when we look at a specific group of migrants, the refugees, who, of course, have specific problems, challenges, and to what extent programs have to be adapted to take into account the specific characteristic, condition, problems they may be facing. First, I think we have to recognize that not everyone is a refugee. When we look at the channels, you have the one that has been largely used in Europe, of course, is the asylum channel, which involves a decision whether or not the individual will be granted a positive response and therefore will be under the Convention status of refugees or other forms of protection. But in other countries, there is also used significantly the resettlement channel, which actually implies involving actually having people come even from the neighboring countries from where people are living, or actually from the country of origin directly. And there are other individual country programs that are not coming through the UNHCR. So I think it is important, again, to bear in mind these distinctions. At the bottom are those who are granted the status of refugees and others in need of international protection. Now, this is very much the topic of your conference. Our conference today is the number of asylum seekers and refugees. In this chart you have for the OECD, for the European Union, and for a country like Germany, the flows we have seen over time. And of course, you have seen a huge increase last year in 2015, actually in the second half of 2015. The numbers are very difficult to account with precision. As you know, there is a lot of problems in double counting, actually registering all of those who come. They're fleeing their countries, oftentimes very dangerous situation, then come into Europe or other countries. It's very difficult to have a precise account. The numbers are extremely overwhelming. We are talking about 1.5 million that have come to the OECD countries only in 2015. 1.3 million to Europe. But I think it's always important to bear in mind that from April of 2011, there's more than 1 million Syrians. And when we look at the country neighboring Syria, we have 4.8 million refugees, including almost 2.8 million only in Turkey, more than 1 million in Lebanon, and almost 650,000 in Jordan. Now, when you remember about the size of the population in Lebanon and Jordan, you can give you a sense of what is the challenge that these countries are facing. You're talking about a fourth, a fifth of the population of a country like Lebanon. So this is very large, significant challenges the countries are facing, also the countries neighboring Syria. There is a lot of heterogeneity along different dimensions. One is, of course, that the point of entry has been traditionally Italy, Lampedusa, then the islands in Greece. You will see in a second that these pathways of the asylum seeker actually evolve extremely rapidly. One of the things that technology is also allowing is for changing the pathways, the routes on a very high frequency, depending on what the countries decide to do in terms of the first country of entry. But there are also differences in terms of the number of asylum seekers that have reached European countries. Here you have the countries which have the largest number of asylum seekers per inhabitant. And of course, there are countries like Sweden, Austria, Germany, as well as Finland and Germany, of course, who have received the largest numbers of asylum seekers. There's also Hungary, but many of those who have entered through Hungary have then left Hungary and moved into other countries. So not all countries in Europe, that's obvious, have been affected in the same way by the number of asylum seekers and therefore refugees that they have received, and for whom they have to provide support. But also there are other countries outside Europe that have been, to some extent, also receiving through different routes, in a number of cases through resettlement. This includes, of course, Australia, Canada, and the United States. I just want to mention that the new Prime Minister of Canada announced a few days after being in office that Canada would have also made a contribution, and they actually managed to receive 25,000 Syrians in a matter of 3 months. And even a country that has long traditional resettlement and also hosting refugees, receiving and placing 25,000 Syrians was not at all an easy task. It requires a stronger commitment and a stronger policy effort that was made by Canada in that context. This is what's happening in 2016. There are many things in this chart. One point when you see the map is that, again, the routes that the asylum seekers, those who are fleeing conflict, fleeing violence, are taking actually changes a lot. We have seen from the south of Italy, as I said before, much more actually coming through the island in Greece, and then from there move on into Europe. I want you to focus just on the chart, which is on the bottom left part of this slide, in which we actually compare the flows in 2015 every month with those of 2016. You see that the peak was reached actually in the fall of 2015, with the number increased dramatically from one month to the other. When we look at that and then we look at what happened in the first part of 2016, there's been a significant slowdown. But I want you to focus and to compare the first month, the first quarter of 2016 with the first quarter of 2015, which is up here. And you can see that all the time, the flows, although smaller than the one in the fall of last year, were much, much higher than what they were in 2015. So if we compare the similar months, and of course the winter months are less, we have seen traditionally less people actually leaving because it's much more difficult, especially by sea, to cross the sea and so on and so forth. We see that the flows are generally much higher than what they were in 2015. Unfortunately, you're all familiar with what happened only a week ago, 10 days ago, with many people actually dying at sea, again, using different routes, back again to the South Mediterranean, coming through Italy via Lampedusa. So yes, the flows are declining, but by no means actually diminishing a lot. And possibly now, with the somewhat better weather, at least in some part of Europe, we might be seeing actually an additional inflows, an additional increase in the flow. So by no means what happened, this significant overwhelming flows we have observed in 2015, we could assume that will actually diminish dramatically. Most likely they will be pick up again, maybe not to the same extent than what happened in 2015, but certainly to some extent. Which means that the crisis and the sheer number that I mentioned to you before, the 1.3 million asylum seekers that have reached Europe last year, will actually continue to grow in terms of the stock because there are further flows coming in 2016. So it's a problem, it's a major issue. Unfortunately, as you know very well, the pushing factor in the origin countries are not improving, and therefore there are many people that may be forced to leave their own country. And as I told you, and you know very well, of course, of the agreement that was reached between Europe and Turkey, there are many millions of Syrians and Iraqi which are just in the neighboring countries that potentially could move to Europe if things do not improve in the countries where they are hosted at the moment. So an unfolding situation is a situation which had a peak in 2015, but unfortunately, although it's very difficult to make any projection in this context, it's not a situation that is easing or is improving, at least in the very short term. Now, why is this crisis different? The obvious is because the numbers are unprecedented. You really have to go back in time at the beginning of the 90s to see such large inflow coming to Europe in such a short period of time. So the sheer number, in my view, is one of the key factors characterizing the crisis here. Second is also because there is a strong concentration of asylum seekers in just a handful of entry points, which is certainly overwhelming this entry point. We have to think about Greece, but also to some extent in Italy, and in terms of destination countries. The third point is also that, and that's what I said before, the advanced technology means that the routes that the smugglers of human traffic are using change very rapidly depending on what decisions are taken by the first country of entry or potentially even the countries that could potentially host the asylum seekers and the refugees. So the flows evolve very rapidly. One thing that many of the asylum seekers have is actually a smartphone. They might not have much more than that, but certainly they have a smartphone, and this smartphone also has information coming from the smuggler about where to go and where there are higher chances to get through. So unfortunately, in this case, technology is also playing a role in making it more difficult to plan at the national level or at the European level. There is a significant diversity of the origin of countries and a deterioration of very significant difficulty that some of the entry countries are facing, and the countries of temporary refuge. And which is perhaps the worst, if you like, of all the different elements that I would like to highlight, we have seen a significant increase in the number of minors and women, but in particular of unaccompanied minors. The number of minors actually is double in share of the total flows. There has been a decline in terms of share of men. There has been an increase in women. Many women are coming with their children, but unfortunately, there are also many children who are coming by themselves, not accompanied by their parents, which of course raises all sorts of issues about what and how to provide adequate support to them. Many of them, of course, have been traumatized by the process. There is a large heterogeneity, and I will say something more later about the characteristics, not only from the country of origin, but also in terms of the skills qualification of the refugees, which makes your task, the task of those who are in the process of providing support and start the process of integration, of recognizing these skills and differentiate the support in order to be more adequate to the action needs of the refugees themselves. And I think we are talking about many crises in parallel in the countries close to Europe with a little prospect of improvement, as I said before. And we are facing in different countries, in different ways, difficult opinion about our citizens in terms of how the response, how the country should shape up their response. Many people, not surprising, also very much concerned. This crisis comes at a time when Europe was recovering after a long period from the global financial economic crisis, and as you know very well, in a number of countries, unemployment is still very high. Unemployment among young people is particularly high, and therefore there is what could be considered a reasonable concern about the fact that can we really afford to have this large number of inflows of refugees. I want just to mention and open and close a bracket here because it's important to remember. When we look at the period before the crisis, from 2000 to 2013, Europe as a whole has benefited from legal migration tremendously. 2/3 of the increase in the working population, in the workforce, has been made up of foreign-born. So there is a significant increase of the workforce that has been made of foreign-born in Europe as a whole. So Europe is already relying significantly from foreign-born people. Now, and this is an important point for our discussion today, we know how difficult it is to integrate into the labor market migrants in general, but in particular refugees. Here's a chart looking at 2008, in which there was a special module in the Eurostat Labor Force Survey, in which we were able to follow people over time and to see how the employment rate, so the ability of individual working age to be in a job, evolved over the duration of their stay in the host country. And you can see that for those who came because of work, so legal migrants coming because of work or because of study and then they stayed on, actually the employment rate is very high, is above 70%, and is actually fairly high from the very beginning. So integration of those who came because of work for obvious reasons, but also those who came to study and then stayed in Europe, there is not much of a problem of integration into the labor market. But when you look at those who came because of family unification, and in particular, those who came because of international protection routes, so the refugees, you see that it takes 5 years to actually reach a 50% employment rate. It takes another 5 years or more to actually reach a level which is in between 60 and 70%. So it takes time to actually promote the access to the labor market into jobs of the refugees. This is a historical picture, of course, looks at the flows of refugees of the past, not necessarily the composition of the refugees of today, but simply it's a reminder that it's not a short-term fix. We are talking about a long process of integration which involves a number of important steps. Now, can we project the future? No, we cannot at all. What we have done, and that was at the end of last year, there was a lot of demand by many countries to say, okay, how can we cope with these large inflows of refugees for our economic reason, but also from a labor market point of view. So what we did, we took two scenarios, a high scenarios and a low scenarios. High scenarios was, let's assume that the flows we have seen in the second half of 2015 will continue in the first half of 16, so high scenario. And what would it mean in terms of people eventually entering into the labor market, moving to employment. And let's look at the low scenario, which is basically, let's assume that the flows will revert back to what they were in the first part of 2015. So you understand very large differences given the large increase in the second half of 15. And with that, you come to a situation in which, even in the high scenario, which has not materialized, because the first months of 16 have seen a slowdown in the flows, as I show you, we are talking about an increase in the people that eventually will get into the labor market, into employment, in Europe as a whole, of about 700,000 people. Let's put into context. What does it mean? Well, it means something like 0.3% of the workforce in Europe. So it's not a large number, but as I told you before, there is a high concentration. So for some countries, this actually means much more than that. For Germany, this could imply 0.7% of the workforce, of the total labor force. And in the high scenario, which again has not materialized as yet, you can talk about 1% of the labor force by the end of 2016. So a significant inflow, but not something which is very large, put into the context of the overall labor force in European countries. Now let me turn quickly, and I want to go through that quickly because to some extent I think help our discussion about what is the role of the public employment service, or some of the lessons we have drawn from the work on the integration of migrants in general, and how these potentially could apply when we look specifically at the refugees. I will go through that quickly because I want then to go to the points about how we see your role, the role of the public employment services in this context. The first point I want to mention is that starting the activation and integration services as soon as possible for the humanitarian migrants and the asylum seekers who we have high prospect to remain in the country is essential. So early intervention have played, by all countries that have implemented them, a fundamental role along different ways. First, to recognize the skill and competence of the asylum seekers and the migrants. First, to create a motivation to actually encourage them to play an active role, and so on and so forth. Of course, and this is a fine trade-off that has to be found, a period in which the asylum seeker cannot actually work is important also to avoid that many more people will eventually enter into the country. But starting some of the elements of the integration process as soon as possible is very important, including language and job preparation training, and also the skill assessment. More or less, we know those who have high chances to get a sort of a status of refugees and will be entitled to the protection, and most likely will be stay in the country for a number of years, also because of the condition in their country of origin, and therefore starting some of the element of the integration process as soon as possible is very important. Here you have the average duration of the asylum procedure. This is based on the data on 2015. Unfortunately, in many countries, this period has lengthened in most of the countries, which means that before the process is over, people might have to wait even a year. And of course, if nothing is happening this year, a lot of problems may actually build up, which will make it more difficult eventually to start the process of integration at a later stage. I think, again, and that's the problem, I show you the favorable waiting periods for the labor market access by asylum seeker in the chart here, again, with reference to 2015. Some early labor market entry can actually promote very much the long-term integration of the refugees into the labor market. So making the labor market access subject to some waiting period may be important, but maybe not too long, because there are a number of steps that can be put in place at an early period. I think that's, again, very important. There is a labor market test that a number of countries, European countries, have already in place, and there is some restriction to sectors in some particular countries. We know that some countries have introduced some fast track for individuals coming from specific professions, specific occupations, and we know how important that is, because these people can actually start playing an active role into our society, not least by helping their own fellow citizens or other refugees who are facing specific problems and concerns. Teachers, doctors, it's just the two professions that come to mind in this particular context. The lesson number 3 is actually the dispersal policy. This is very difficult because, of course, there are different approaches that countries are facing. Many countries are overwhelmed by the numbers, and there are approaches whereby in countries in which refugees cannot choose where to go, there are dispersal policies that use different criteria, different parameters, including a fair distribution across the countries. But I think the point I want to make here, and I know how difficult it is, to take the employment opportunities into account over and above one of the factors which is often used for obvious reasons, which is the housing availability. Here, just an example for Sweden about the 8 years after dispersal from refugees subject to the housing-led dispersal policy. We notice a 25% lower earning. We note a 6 to 8 percentage point lower employment rate. And we notice a 40% higher welfare dependency, when the decision about dispersal was based largely on the housing availability without taking into account necessarily the availability of jobs. And unfortunately, as you know very well, where there is more housing availability, there might be fewer job opportunities. So I know how difficult it is, but I think the idea of taking the two elements into account, if we believe that access to the labor market, job opportunity is a fundamental element to promote the process of integration of the migrants in general, but the refugees in particular, then I think taking into account both the housing, of course, but also the labor market opportunities, in my view, it's important. And I think there are a number of elements, the skill profiles of the refugees, the local job vacancies, the local labor market condition, the specific shortages that some areas may have more than others, and also, of course, avoid the problem of segregation, where migrants or refugees are concentrated in some areas, overwhelming also, of course, the local communities. The fourth lesson is actually about the assessing the foreign-born qualifications, work experience and skills, and use different assessment methods to document what is missing. Many of the refugees come with no paper, no certification of their skills, of their qualifications. And again, as a part of the process of integration into the labor market, recognizing the skills, but I would say more than just a simple qualification. Recognize what they can do. Many of them might have 20 years of work experience or more, and they might know a lot. They might actually have acquired a lot of competence during their work experience, which might not be certified in their qualification. So starting as soon as possible a process of recognition of skills and qualification is very important. But again, if we remember what I said before about the very significant heterogeneity of the characteristic of the refugees in terms of skill, age, competences, it's also very important to differentiate what is offered to them in terms of language training, which might be important for everybody, but also in terms of education and training opportunity that may be given to them. A number of countries have introduced early on system of skill recognition and through different ways, including, again, simple tests that allow to assess, at least in a prima facie way, what are the basic competences of the refugee, which helps a lot also designing the most specific, more apt, more targeted programs they might benefit from. There is really a need of a systematic assessment and adjusted recognition procedures. And again, I know how difficult it is when you're dealing with a very significant increase in number of those who have to go through that. That's the point I want to mention about the taking into account the significant diversity of skills of the humanitarian migrants. Here we are looking at 2015, and we are looking at Sweden, and then we are looking at individuals coming from different countries. And you see the distribution by the level of education. This is not actually the actual competencies, it's simply the level of education. But when you look at people coming from Iran, from Syria, and from Iraq, you're talking about 40% of them have more than upper secondary level of education. Many of them are fairly high skilled, and therefore the process of integration into the labor market can be relatively easier once they receive access to language training and when the skills and work experience is recognized. So this means basically a tailor-made integration program that includes flexible duration of the integration program. For example, in Sweden there is the introduction program, which is a 2-year long. It might be too short for some and maybe potentially too long for others. So I think it's important to some extent to promote also the full integration into the labor market outside the program, if possible. The modular learning language training, targeted course for specific groups, like the illiterate, and there are many of them in a number of, coming from a number of countries, as well as for the highly educated and for mothers for whom it might be more difficult to enter into the labor market. The on-the-job training, again, the important point here is also to involve the employers into this. One of the best ways to integrate, of course, to give them a job opportunity, but also to help them acquire even language, if you like, competences through the job, through working. And this, I think, is possible, at least for some, in some professions. This is a particular problem, again, given the reason for which many people have actually left their country, fled their country. And this is about physical, but in particular, I would like to underline the mental health problem. Again, the data are very difficult to collect here. I just present you from the WHO some estimate of the mental health issues of adult population affected by emergencies. You don't have to go to the severe disorders, but if you look at the mild and moderate mental disorder, you can see the difference between those who come from the previous 2 months, before the emergency and after the emergency. You see a significant increase in the share of those who actually suffer from mild to moderate mental health disorder. A number of these problems can be addressed, but this requires specific support for the people affected by this, because sometimes their integration will not start, will not actually be successful unless we also help them on the psychological point of view. Many of them, I don't have to tell you, have gone through severe trauma, and especially for young people, but also for mothers and for everybody else, it might be very difficult to then suddenly move straight into an integration phase. That's the point I want to mention, because yes, there are many unaccompanied children, but in particular, in my view, there is a group that is very much at risk. These are young people who might be outside, if you like, the compulsory schooling, but actually have reached very low level of education, who might be tempted to enter the labor market as soon as possible, because for them this is a way to actually build and starting their life in the country or that is hosting them, might not actually have the right minimum level of skills to perform well into the labor market. So programs effort there to try to help them to reconnect with the world of education, so that's a minimum level of skills beyond language, if you like. I think it's important to secure a, if you like, smoother or more successful transition into the labor market. In my view, beyond children, of course, who have specific needs and have to be integrated into the schooling system as soon as possible, this group, in my view, requires specific attention, because, again, otherwise, by not giving them, by not promoting their reintegration into the education system, it might be difficult for them later on to actually succeed into the labor market. This is a general point, but I think I want to highlight that because there is no way in which policy makers at the national level, at the local level, the public agencies can do everything here. And one of the things that really characterized when I've been traveling in different countries is to see how much is going on the ground at the community level, in the municipalities, involving the NGOs, the civil society, the employers, the trade unions, all different stakeholders that have a role to play. There is a lot that actually is going on, and I think it is important to actually make sure that all of these efforts, all of these activities are somewhat coordinated in a way to really make a difference. There is no way in which the public employment survey can by themselves solve all the problem, and I think there is a lot that you can also rely upon by working with the civil society, by working with the NGOs, which are working on the ground, with the, of course, social case manager, and all the others who are actually at the local level, on the ground, providing support in different ways. So here there are different elements of what I think it's in my view, important. Then there's a problem about the equal access in different parts of the country, which again is very important. We already know that, despite national policies, what really matters is what happens on the ground at the local level. And sometimes the standards might be different. And the integration process very much depends on the support that the individual receive in the areas in which they've been assigned, in which they live. So build the exchange of expertise across the municipalities, provide adequate financial support and incentive. What we have seen in a number of countries that municipalities receive resources to deal with the refugees on the basis of the headcount, the number of refugees they have to support. But to the extent to which the characteristics of these refugees are very different, depending on different municipalities, receiving the same amount of money may not be adequate. So to some extent, tailor the support to the specific need of the communities that different communities have to deal with. I think it's important. I know how difficult it is, but I think it's an important element I want to highlight. Pool the resources, allow for some specialization. Some areas might be more apt to provide support to some community or to workers, to refugees with some specific characteristics. And also guarantee a minimum standard that will apply across the board. The other point I want to mention is actually is a specific effort that, in my view, is needed to the very low educated humanitarian migrants. I told you before about the difficulties in many of refugees to actually integrate into the labor market. This is a particular problem, of course, for the low skills. In a country like Sweden, in which the labor market has such high standards in terms of skills, in terms of remuneration, and so on and so forth, for some of the very low skilled refugees in Sweden, or in other countries like Germany and so on, it is particularly difficult for the very low skilled refugees to find their place into the labor market. So building some basic fundamental skills, in my view, is very important. Here I have a chart with the employment rate in Europe, in the European OECD country in 2008, by level of education. Again, you see a very large difference between the very low skill and the high skill. So what is the role of the public employment service? How all of this boils down to your role? And I very much like to hear from you more than for me to say, but let me just highlight some of the points which I think might be relevant for our conversation today and tomorrow. One is that I think we all agree, and certainly want to highlight it again. In the report we have just issued a few weeks ago on Sweden, on the integration of refugees in Sweden, this is the number one point we have highlighted, is actually the labor market integration is one of the key fundamental steps into the overall integration of the refugees into our host countries. Second is because perhaps more than anybody else, refugee job seeker needs you more than any other job seeker. They cannot count on their networks, where their families, where their relatives, where the employers. They come and there's a huge asymmetric information problem here. They don't know the labor market in which they would have to enter. They cannot rely on the formal or informal channels that provide the key information for them to navigate into the labor market of the country that is hosting them. Also because the public employment service, national, can guarantee some dissemination of the good practices. And I think, again, there's a lot to be learned from the experience within a country from what happened in different communities. And there's a lot to be learned on how to adapt national programs into the specific issues that you're facing. So more than ever, I think learning by doing and learning from each other, in my view, is very important. And also because you can guarantee some common standards. So there's an element of fairness there. I think it's very important also, and in Sweden this is the case with the introduction program, to coordinate the different elements of the integration process beyond also the labor market. So the fact that there is one-stop shop in which refugees can receive support and orientation And mentoring, to some extent, in my view, is also very, very important. Where this is done by the Public Employment Service or by other institutions, it is very important. It's a very good collaboration and coordination of the different activities and support that is provided to the refugees, again, to promote their labor market, but also more general social integration. What are some of the challenges? Well, the first is obvious, is the overwhelming numbers of people that you have to deal with. Now, it depends on the country. Some of you have seen the unemployment rate for declining, so the worst has been, if you like, over. Other, of course, European countries are still facing significant high level of unemployment, in particular youth unemployment. So how to deal with the native unemployed people and job seekers with this additional supply of refugees, of course, a significant problem. The other is that I think, again, from what we have been saying during my presentation, certainly throughout our discussion, the refugees need just more than just some job counseling and orientation about job opportunities. They really need to be helped in understanding better how the labor market in your country works and functions, what are the rules, how to approach an employer, and so on and so forth. And again, the coordination, because through your work, actually, you might help them having access to other types of services, health, mental health, and beyond, as well as social services, and so on and so forth. The problem is actually that, again, the chart I showed you before, this might not need only a quick fix, some orientation, some language. It might need a more continued, if you like, process of support. And again, you are facing, I guess, the challenge, how can I devote resources to that number of refugees who need long-term support before they can actually integrate, while I also take care of all the other clients I have to deal with. And that, of course, requires a very fine-tuning of the allocation of resources within your public employment service. And again, the point I was mentioning before, for many of the migrants, legal migrants, they come with ties, either family ties, relationship, and so on and so forth. This might not be the case of the refugees. Some of them have entered your country because they knew that there were more opportunity there, but we now necessarily have any particular tie, any particular knowledge of the context in which they will be. The other, of course, is that you're facing with a very heterogeneous group. Even within the same nationality I showed you before, even when you're dealing with Syrian refugees, some of them are high-skilled and might be quickly integrated through fast-track processes. They just maybe need some recognition of their skills and some language training. Others are totally unskilled. Some of them are actually illiterate. So the problems and the challenges and the tailoring of the support, of course, varies dramatically across the group. Some of the growing numbers of unsecured temporary legal status. I mean, many countries are moving to sort of when you receive a refugee, it's only on a temporary basis, so for 1 year, for 2 years, which might create problems on both sides. On the refugees themselves, because they might be less keen to invest on the language of the country, on the integration process, because they don't know whether they will be able to stay. And also on the side of the employers, who might be less keen to invest on the refugees, to hire a refugee, if they don't know whether or not that person will actually be allowed to stay for longer. So there is possibly a vicious circle, and I do understand perfectly why you move into a temporary refugee status. But on the other hand, this may actually affect your ability to actually promote the process of integration. And I think I make the point about the low educated. So these are some of the key points I want to highlight. By no means these are solutions, and more just to highlight some of the challenges that, of course, you know very well from your perspective. But let me just conclude with a general point, and I think this is very much what I said at the very beginning of my talk. Your role, more than ever, I think, is essential for actually providing the positive response to this humanitarian refugee crisis. Let me underline the word humanitarian. Here we are talking a lot about the economic integration of refugees, but when we talk about that, we always have to remember that we are talking about people fleeing conflict, fleeing violence, many of them risking their life. And we need also to provide support for a humanitarian point of view. Yes, it is overwhelming. Yes, it is costly to provide effective support. Yes, there might be tensions in the countries, in localities, in the communities in which they are hosted. But I think this is something that not just each individual countries, but all together with the international community, Europe and beyond, I think is an important positive response we have to give to provide hope to all of those who are fleeing their countries and to give them a chance in the countries in which we are hosting them. And your work is perhaps more important than the work of anybody else, because having an opportunity into the labor market for the adults, of course, is a very important step into the integration process. I'm very much cognizant of the big, huge challenges you are facing, but I think I want to say that a big thank you because whatever you do is very, very important, and I think I would be very glad also to hear your comments to what I said, but also your experience, because if anything, what we have been doing at OECD is actually to make sure that your experience is known also by others. We have been organizing a conference like this, and I was always impressed, I must say, that beyond the slogan that sometimes populate the newspapers, there is a lot going on the ground, and a lot of good things going on the ground. And of course, you are part of this positive solution to this global humanitarian refugee crisis. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scarpetta. It's been very interesting. I wonder if you would like to read this book that you are referring to. Where could you find it?
On the web. It's available on the web,
website.
and I will be more than happy to send you a copy as well. But you can download it from the web. And we are doing a number of other reviews like this for a number of other countries.
Yeah, so I read. So you get a free copy. That's what I understood.
Yes, absolutely.
You will get a lot of business cards. And also, I would like to inform you all, because I saw that you were taking pictures of the slides, and all the slides, all the presentations will be on the WAPES website after the meeting. So you will get to all the pictures, all the slides there. We have actually like 5 minutes. Questions from the audience to Mr. Scarpetta. Have we got anyone? There are 2 microphones. Paula has one microphone over there, and Anna-Lena has a microphone over there. And we need to use the microphones all the time when we speak in the audience, because everything is recorded. There we have a question. Anna-Lena is running.
Hi, great presentation. Thanks for making time and for preparing. My question is on the integration of refugees using networks. In your remarks, you mentioned that they weren't prepared to connect to networks in the host countries. What kind of approaches have you seen that would enable more success in helping them network, for example, to refugees that had come and settled 5-10 years ago, or to localities where they're being placed, or even to employment counselors or other PES staff that they encounter? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for this question. I think there are very different approaches. I'll give you one example. I told you before that Canada has been using this resettlement. There was a plea that was made by the Prime Minister to actually receive 25,000 Syrians in a 3-month period, which even for Canada, I told you, was a major challenge. One of the criteria they used to decide where to suggest that the refugees, the Syrians, were to go in the different provinces of Canada, were the existence of networks of Syrians in these different provinces, because this provides an informal support to those who actually come. Many of them actually have family ties with people in different parts of Canada. This was one of the factors that was taken into account, because we know all that very well. This happened informally, but it's actually an essential factor in how can I say, be perceived to be welcome in the region, in the area, in the local community in which you actually arrive. And also because you can receive a lot of information on a very informal basis, will help the overall process of integration economically, labor market-wise, but also from a social point of view as well. I think, again, in Sweden, there are many Syrians coming to Sweden, because also there are sort of Syrians that have been here for 1 or 2 generations, and therefore they know that you can exploit these family connection or these community connections. But I think, again, I know that in many communities, in many local areas, the communities of former refugees or former migrants are actually playing an active role in providing support, providing this informal set of information, which is actually very, very important in my view to create a positive process, if you like, of integration. There's much you can do, the public agency can do, but I think this informal channel are also very important. So not only recognizing them, but using them, I would say, in the positive sense of the term, I think is an important step. And listening to them, so hearing their voice, their experience, in my view, is an important part of these 4 element that I was showing you before by using the public agencies, the NGOs, the local communities, the social partner employers and unions, all of them, I think, can play a very important supporting role to the role that you're playing and other public agencies are playing.
Thank you very much. And there is actually two questions, but we start with you, madam.
Yeah, Petra Draxl, Public Employment Service Vienna. I totally agree with very different aspects you have presented, but I don't follow your arguments in the integration of good qualified people. Yeah, because who are the good qualified people or formal good qualified people coming from those countries? I'm thinking on doctors, lawyers, so specific professions, and for us it's not easy to integrate them. Yeah, think if you're a Syrian doctor, on the average you have to need 3 to 5 years for the notification process in Austria. So these are high qualified persons, but on the other hand, it's also very challenging for us to have a very specific program for them to integrate them in the labor market on a long-term run. So my question is on what kind of professions or what kind of high qualified people you're thinking where it's easy to integrate them in our labor markets.
That's a very good question. Actually, I would like to hear from the experience of other countries, because from what I know, there are countries like Sweden in particular, but also Germany, in which there are some fast-track programs for the integration of high-skill refugees and migrants in some professions, including teachers and doctors. Some of them are actually working for the refugees themselves, are providing support to other fellow refugees. I know how difficult it is because you have recognition requirements, and therefore being a doctor in Syria or in Iraq does not mean that you can be a doctor in Austria or in other countries. That's why I mentioned before, I'm not denying that it's complicated, but I think there you have a talent, you have a human capital which is very high, and I think starting as soon as possible the process of recognition, I think is very important. Now, there is a much more difficult question, and that is, can we also allow a doctor, while he or she goes through the process of recognition of his competences in Austria, in that particular case, to actually work maybe in a different job that does not really require the whole skills that a doctor might have, just to make sure that that person is starting the integration process before the integration of the recognition of his skills and competences are actually fully done. But I think that would be important. Of course, for some of them, might not be easy because they were doctors in their own country. Now they have to do something else. But there are ways in which they might start working in the same area of activity while the process of the recognition of the competence. And many of them, I'm pretty sure, are willing to have their titles, their competences be recognized in those countries. Again, in a context in which we are thinking about a medium-term integration process. It's not just for 1 year or 2 years. That's what brings me back to the point about the temporary protection programs, which may not necessarily be fully consistent with the idea that you have to invest over a certain period of time before your profession, your qualification can be fully recognized. But I think in general, I would say, try to understand what are the qualifications, so the level of education, but also the actual competences of the refugee, in my view, is very important. What we are doing here is just a beginning of a process. Some of you might be familiar with. At the OECD, we have developed this adult skill survey. It's a survey that was run in 24 plus 9 countries now, that is aimed at assessing the actual competence of people of working age in the OECD countries. We are now thinking of using a subset of that pretty complex survey as a tool that can be put on a tablet and can be given actually to the case officer who are dealing with the refugees to try to assess, at least at the basic level, what are the actual competences of the refugees, to be able to identify better what kind of service, what kind of approach, what kind of training program may be most suitable for them. It's a step in this process of being able to not only integrate into any job, but actually help matching their skills, the potential with the job that is offered to them, even if it takes time.
We have time for one more question, so please, the last question.
Okay. Becker, Germany, Bundesagentur für Arbeit. I have a question behind your findings. And do you have evidence what is the best strategy? I'll give you an example. When I take a look to US, there you have in the first time a burst of initial help, and afterwards refugees are expected to fend for themselves. On the other side, for example, here in Sweden and in Germany, you start with a big package of generous social support, and afterwards you have barriers, you have obstacles to come to the labor market. For example, minimum wage and so on. What is the best way? Do you have experience? Can you give us a hint?
This is indeed a key question. And I know how difficult it is, but I think from what I said in my presentation, to some extent, differentiating the approach, in my view, is part of the solution. I think in this country we have the introduction program, which is 2 years, very intense support at different level, from language to training, a retraining program, to job counseling and so on and so forth. And then after 2 years, the person is expected to enter the labor market, although there are specific programs, including some wage subsidy, that help the refugees actually to enter into formal jobs. Maybe 2 years is too long for some of the high-skilled refugees who can actually enter into formal labor market without particular support in a shorter period of time. Maybe others with very low skills need more time. However, I know how difficult it is to design a system which actually is very flexible to each individual, to the characteristic of each individual refugees. But I think in Sweden, at least in Sweden, is facing this problem of the 2 year, very effective support with the public employment service being actually playing a major role there. And for some, it's not enough. So after 2 years, then they enter into the labor market. They might not yet have all the tools that would allow a full integration into the labor market. So I think you, basically, public employment service, to the extent to which you have the general policy to help you on that, to try to distinguish, to try to differentiate, to try to tailor the support in a way that can be more effective, recognizing that I think the problem the refugees are facing are totally different. For some, again, with very low level of skills, the process is actually learning a basic element of the language of the country. For others, maybe they can operate even without knowing much of the language because they have their own skills. They can operate and so on and so forth. So differentiate as much as possible and devote the resources where actually the need are the most. Now, what is the problem here? And this is not just for the refugees, I think it's a problem that you're facing every day. Should we face on the difficult case or should we focus on the easy case so that we can move them into the labor market and then have more resources? I think in the case of the humanitarian migrants, I would argue more in favor of helping those with the biggest problem. Because otherwise you build tension at the individual level, potentially at the social level in the community, and so on and so forth. And again, as far as possible, and that's the question for you more or less, how do we bring the employers into this? How do we make sure we can overcome some of the resistance employers may have to actually receive refugees as workers? I mean, in Sweden, when we present this book, one of the things that emerged, they have a very generous wage subsidies for refugees, which goes up to 80%, if I'm not mistaken. And yet, when you look at the take-up rate, it's very low. So there is a discussion in Sweden, and it will not take too much time, about lowering the minimum wage to allow low-skilled refugees to enter the labor market. At the same time, you have a program in which you get 80% wage subsidy, and yet not that many employers are willing to take refugees. So there is something to be done there to remove some of the barriers of resistance, of difficulty, of lack of understanding that also some employers may be facing about, be willing to benefit from this wage subsidy and take on some of the refugees. So I think, again, it's your role of mediating with the employers, bringing the employers more as part of the solution, which in my view is very important.
Thank you so much. I see that more of you have questions to Mr. Scarpetta, but I believe that you are staying for the rest of the conference, right?
Today, yes.
So you will have time to ask the questions, I'm sure.